My world was circumscribed by the scent of lye and the damp, weeping chill of stone. I was a laundress, one of a dozen anonymous women who served the silent keep. And my greatest luxury was a sense of humor so dry it was practically a fire hazard. We worked in the underbelly of the fortress, a place of echoing drips and eternal twilight, where the only seasons were damp and less damp. My hands were perpetually chapped. My back ached with a familiarity that felt like an old friend, and my ambition extended no further than a hot meal, a dry bed, and being left profoundly alone. Life was a rhythm of scrub, rinse, wring, and fold, a litany against the grand, cold silence that emanated from the throne room far above. The silence had a name: Lord Valerius, our Alpha King. He was a figure of legend and whispers, a man forged from the north wind and granite. They said he had not laughed in a decade, not since the curse or the sorrow, the stories changed with the teller, had settled over him and his line. He ruled with a stillness that was more terrifying than any rage. His decrees were like chips of ice falling from a glacier, precise, cold, and utterly impersonal. We, in the steamy depths of the laundry, felt them mostly as ripples. New standards for the bleaching of linens, stricter rationing of soap, edicts on the precise temperature of rinse water. They were the nonsensical whims of a man who had never felt the chafe of a wet seam against his own skin. One dreary morning, a new one arrived, read aloud by a steward whose face was pinched with the permanent disapproval of his station. It was a masterpiece of pointless bureaucracy, a multi-part pronouncement on the moral and organizational failings of unpaired hosiery. It decreed that any sock found without its partner at the end of a wash cycle was to be logged in a ledger, its description noted in triplicate, and the offending laundress docked a quarter-hour's pay. I stood there, steam curling around my face, my arms aching from hauling a cauldron of boiling water, and listened to this man drone on about the existential tragedy of a single lonely sock. Something inside me, a cord of patience worn thin by years of thankless labor and damp chilblains, finally snapped. It wasn't a decision. It was a force of nature, like a flood or a sneeze. A laugh erupted from my chest, loud and unlovely and utterly genuine. It echoed off the slick stone walls, a shocking burst of sound in the consecrated silence of our drudgery. The other women froze, their eyes wide with terror. The steward stopped mid-sentence, his mouth a perfect O of indignation. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before, thick with my transgression. And in that silence I saw him. Lord Valerius was standing in the arched doorway at the far end of the hall, half shrouded in shadow. He wasn't supposed to be there. The Alpha King did not conduct inspections of the laundry. It was fundamentally absurd. Yet there he was. He was as still as the stories claimed, a figure carved from winter stone, his presence sucking the meager warmth from the air. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were fixed directly on me. He had seen it all. The decree. My insolent, unforgivable laughter. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, the certainty of dismissal, or worse. But he didn't move. He just watched me, his face a closed ledger, and in his gaze was not the fury I expected, but a flicker of something else. Something I couldn't name. A question, perhaps. The fortress held its breath, and in that moment, I, a laundress named Elara, had been well and truly seen. That night, huddled in the kitchens with Marta, the head cook, and the closest thing I had to a friend, I recounted the tale. Marta, a woman built like a fortress herself, with a heart as warm as her ovens, clucked her tongue and slipped me a heel of bread dripping with honey. "You're lucky he didn't have you flogged, Elara. Laughing at an alpha's decree? What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about the socks," I said, my voice muffled by the bread. "A ledger for socks. Honestly, Marta, the man needs a hobby. Or a wife. Someone to distract him from the impending hosiery apocalypse." I leaned back against the warm brick of the hearth. "I swear, this keep is so wound up, it's going to snap. At this point, I'd wed the first wolf that came through that door, if it meant a bit of cheerful chaos." Marta laughed, a deep, rumbling sound. It was a foolish, bitter joke, spat into the smoky air of the kitchen, and I thought nothing more of it. A jest, like a puff of steam, destined to vanish without a trace. 2 nights later, the wolf came. I was in my cell of a room, a space barely large enough for a cot and a small chest, mending a tear in my only good shift by the light of a tallow candle. The wind was a thief, rattling the ill-fitting shutter and stealing what little warmth I had. Then a new sound, a soft scratching at my door. I froze, my needle hovering. It wasn't a human sound. It was too deliberate for a rat, too quiet for a dog. With my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs, I lifted the bar and opened the door a crack. It was immense. A great, shadow-black wolf sat on its haunches in the corridor, its head level with my own. Its fur was the color of a moonless night, and its eyes were a startling, molten gold, burning with an intelligence that was unnervingly familiar. Panic seized me, cold and sharp, but it was followed by a wave of utter confusion. The wolf was not snarling. It was not threatening. It simply watched me, its head cocked to one side as if in curiosity. Then, with a delicate motion that seemed absurd for such a powerful creature, it nudged something forward with its nose. A sock. A single gray, impeccably darned wool sock. It laid it on my threshold like a sacred offering. I stared at the sock, then back at the wolf. Its golden eyes held mine, and there was an expression in them that I could only describe as expectant. Maybe even a little proud. This was not a beast of the wild. This was something else entirely. My mind, which had been racing with fear, screeched to a halt on a single impossible thought. The stillness, the silent, watchful intensity, the eyes. I slowly closed the door, my hand trembling, and leaned against the rough wood, the echo of my foolish joke to Marta ringing in my ears. The first wolf through the door. The next day, Lord Valerius requested my presence. It was not a summons to the throne room for punishment, but a quiet word from his second-in-command, Ronan. A man whose face was a constant battle between grim duty and a desperate desire to laugh. Ronan found me by the lye vats, his fine leather boots looking deeply offended by the damp floor. "Lord Valerius requires your consultation," he said, his voice unnaturally formal. "Regarding a textile matter." He led me not to a dungeon, but to the king's private library. It was a place I had only ever dreamed of, a cathedral of knowledge smelling of old parchment, beeswax, and wood smoke. Bookshelves soared into the vaulted darkness above, and a fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. And there, standing by the fire, was the Alpha King himself. He was not wearing his formal armor or stiff regalia, but a simple tunic of dark wool that made him seem younger and somehow more formidable. He did not look at me. He was staring intently at a small wooden crate on the mantelpiece, as if it held the secrets to the universe. You, he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. He still didn't look at me. The laundress. Elara, my lord, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Elara. He tested the name, then finally turned his gaze on me. The stormy sea was turbulent today. There has been an intrusion. A creature of the forest has been breaching the keep's security. He sounded like he was reading an official report. A mechanical hitch in his throat betrayed the effort it took. It has been rearranging things. He gestured vaguely at the crate. My personal effects. I stepped closer, my curiosity overriding my fear. Inside the crate, nestled on a bed of dried leaves and moss, was a bizarre collection of objects. A handful of shiny pebbles, a raven's feather, a half-eaten loaf of bread, clearly stolen from the kitchens, and my thimble, my small, dented, silver thimble. Lying next to it was a single, freshly laundered, perfectly folded chemise. Mine. The beast shows an affinity for your work, he said, the words sounding like they were being dragged from him by hooks. He looked profoundly, excruciatingly embarrassed. The great, cold, unfeeling Alpha King, who commanded armies and ruled a kingdom with an iron will, was blushing. It was a faint tide of color on the sharp planes of his cheekbones, but it was there. He was mortified by the actions of his other self, this great, earnest wolf that brought me stolen laundry and shiny rocks like a suitor. It seems to have excellent taste, my lord, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. My cursed, reckless tongue. For a second, I thought he would explode. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched. It was the barest flicker of movement, the geological shifting of a continent, but it was undeniably the beginning of a smile. It died before it could be born, but I had seen it. You are to be relocated, he said abruptly, turning back to the fire. Your expertise is required here. In the upper keep, you will be assigned quarters near the library to advise on textile integrity and intrusion prevention. That is how I, Elara, became the royal sock consultant. Ronan, who had been standing by the door looking like he was about to burst a blood vessel from suppressed laughter, simply bowed and said, "This way, specialist." The title was so absurd, so transparently a lie, that it was almost honest. I was being brought into the heart of the fortress, into the king's own domain, not for my skill with lye and water, but because a great black wolf had stolen my underwear. My new life was a study in contrasts. I went from a damp, noisy basement to a small, quiet chamber with a real window that looked out over the frost-kissed central courtyard. My duties were as vague as my title. I was to organize the king's library, mend his books, and be available. It was this last part that was the most unnerving. I spent my days in the hallowed silence of the library, the scent of old paper my constant companion. Lord Valerius was often there, working at his massive oak desk, a mountain of ledgers and maps before him. We existed in a shared silence that was different from the oppressive quiet of the lower keep. This silence was alive, a breathing thing that stretched between us. I would watch him from the corner of my eye as I stitched a loose binding or carefully dusted a forgotten tome. I saw the weight he carried. It was in the taut line of his shoulders, the way he would rub the bridge of his nose when he thought no one was looking, the deep, abiding loneliness in his eyes when he stared into the fire. The frozen king was a man, I realized, a man trapped inside a cage of duty and sorrow. He, in turn, watched me. I would feel his gaze on me as I worked, a heavy, assessing weight. He never spoke much, but when he did, the words were carefully chosen. He asked me about the books I was mending. He asked for my opinion on the quality of new parchment. One afternoon, he found me trying to reach a book on a high shelf, precariously balanced on a stool. He said nothing, simply strode over, his large frame eclipsing the light, and plucked the book from the shelf with ease. He handed it to me, our fingers brushing for a fleeting second. The touch was like a spark of flint in the cold air, a sudden, unexpected warmth that shot up my arm. His stormy eyes widened almost imperceptibly before he turned and stalked back to his desk, the silence between us now crackling with a new energy. The wolf continued its strange courtship. It would leave gifts for me outside my new chamber door, a string of dried wildflowers, a piece of honeycomb, sticky and sweet. Once a single, perfect, and very expensive-looking pearl earring, which I promptly and discreetly returned to Ronan, who accepted it with a weary sigh and the air of a man long accustomed to his lord's romantic eccentricities. The man, Valerius, never acknowledged the gifts, but the day after the honeycomb appeared, a small pot of honey from the royal hives was added to my breakfast tray. The day after the wildflowers, a single, perfect rose was in a vase on my windowsill. He was speaking to me in two languages at once, the direct, instinctual language of the wolf and the painfully subtle, deniable language of the king. A slow thaw had begun. The glacier was melting, drip by painful drip. He started seeking me out for conversations that had nothing to do with textiles. He would bring me a difficult passage from an old text, asking for my interpretation. He would read aloud a ridiculous report from a provincial lord and watch my face for a reaction, waiting for that spark of shared, dry amusement. One evening, as a cold rain lashed against the windows, he looked up from his work, his face etched with weariness. "This silence, he said, his voice quiet. "It is loud, is it not?" "It is, my lord," I replied, my needle pausing over a torn page. "Some silences are empty. This one feels full." He considered that for a long moment. "Full of what?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "Ghosts, I think," I said softly. "And things left unsaid." A shadow passed over his face, a deep and ancient pain. "Yes," he whispered, "things left unsaid." In that moment, the space between us shrank. We were no longer king and laundress, but two people sharing a quiet room, acknowledging the heavy, invisible burdens we both carried. It was a fragile connection, a secret woven in the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, a world away from the rigid ceremony of the court. And it was this quiet intimacy, this shared secret, that would soon put us all in mortal danger. If you're enjoying our time here in the Silent Keep, and you want to see if this glacier ever fully melts, go ahead and hit that like button. It tells the storytellers around the fire that you want to hear more tales just like this one. Our quiet world could not remain hidden forever. The court, like nature, abhors a vacuum, and the space I now occupied at the king's side had long been coveted by another. Lady Seraphina of the House of Volkov was the woman everyone assumed Valerius would marry. She was highborn, politically connected, and beautiful in the way a freshly forged blade is beautiful. All sharp angles, polished surfaces, and merciless intent. Her eyes were the color of ice, and they missed nothing. She had been watching the king's strange new preoccupation with his sock specialist, with a cold, calculating fury. She chose her moment perfectly. It was a formal dinner in the great hall, a rare occasion that required my attendance, ostensibly to observe the wear and tear on the ceremonial tapestries. I stood near the wall, feeling as out of place as a field mouse at a convocation of eagles. Seraphina, draped in silver silk that shimmered like a serpent's skin, glided over to me. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "I must confess, I am fascinated by your new role," she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby lords and ladies to hear. They turned, their faces alight with cruel curiosity. The little laundress, elevated to such a vital position. Tell me, what is the most pressing matter of state you've handled today? A grass stain on the king's breeches? A particularly stubborn ring of grime? The courtiers tittered. My face burned with humiliation. I was a novelty to them, a piece of gossip. I opened my mouth to reply, though I had no idea what I would say. But Valerius's voice cut through the air, as cold and sharp as a winter wind. "Lady Seraphina!" He had not moved from his seat at the high table, but his presence filled the hall. "You are mistaken. Specialist Elara was just giving me her counsel on the proposed grain tariffs with the Southern Protectorate." He turned his stormy gaze on me, and there was a silent command in it. "Play along." "Elara, you were saying that Lord Voronov's shipping estimates are— what was the word you used?" My mind raced. I had seen the scrolls on his desk. I had heard him muttering about them. "Optimistic, my lord," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Grossly optimistic. He fails to account for spoilage during the spring thaw. His numbers are a fiction designed to inflate his own importance." A stunned silence fell over the hall. Lady Seraphina's face was a mask of fury. The king had not only defended me, he had publicly solicited my opinion on a matter of state, treating me as a trusted advisor in front of the entire court. He had taken her mockery and turned it back on her, exposing her as petty while elevating me. He held my gaze for a moment longer, a subtle but unmistakable declaration. "You are under my protection." The lines had been drawn, and Lady Seraphina was not a woman who accepted defeat. Her retaliation was not long in coming, and it was as subtle and venomous as she was. It happened a week later. I was returning to my chambers from the library late one evening, carrying a stack of books. The corridor was deserted, lit by flickering torches that threw long, dancing shadows. As I passed beneath a massive ancient tapestry depicting a great wolf hunt, I heard a faint, ominous creak from above. I glanced up just in time to see the heavy iron rod that held the tapestry tearing away from the stone wall. There was no time to scream, no time to run. I simply threw myself forward, a desperate instinctual act. The tapestry, weighing as much as a full-grown man, crashed down where I had been standing a second before. It hit the flagstones with a deafening thud that shook the floor, sending up a cloud of ancient dust. I lay sprawled on the cold stone, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. My arm, which had been scraped raw against the floor, throbbed with a fiery pain. I was alive, but only by a breath. Slowly, I pushed myself up. My first thought was not of my own safety, but of proof. This was no accident. I scrambled over to the fallen tapestry and examined the place where the rod had been mounted. The iron brackets were intact, but the rope that had been looped through them, a safety measure added years ago, had been cut. Not frayed, not worn through. Cut. sliced cleanly with a very sharp blade. Fear was a cold serpent coiling in my gut, but it was quickly being consumed by a hot, unfamiliar rage. She had tried to kill me. She had tried to crush me like an insect and sweep me away. She thought I would be too scared, too insignificant to do anything about it. She was wrong. Clutching the severed rope in my hand, I did not run to my room. I did not hide. I turned and marched, my torn sleeve dripping a thin line of blood onto the stones, directly toward the one place I knew he would be, the council chamber, where he was holding his nightly meeting with his senior lords. I threw open the heavy oak doors without knocking. The dozen men seated around the great table looked up, their faces a mixture of shock and annoyance at the interruption. Valerius was at the head of the table, and when he saw me, disheveled, bleeding, my face pale with shock, but my eyes blazing with fury, he was on his feet in an instant. The air in the room seemed to crackle and drop 20 degrees. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. But the question was not for me. It was for the world at large, a demand to know what had dared to harm me. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, I saw the wolf looking out from behind his eyes. The gold flared, predatory and incandescent, and a primal stillness fell over him, the stillness of a predator that has caught the scent of a threat to its mate. The other lords shrank back in their seats, their hands instinctively moving toward their swords. They had seen it too. "An accident, my lord," I said, my voice shaking but clear. I walked forward and placed the severed rope on the polished surface of the council table. In the west corridor, the tapestry of the hunt, Valerius looked from the rope to my bleeding arm. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His face had become a mask of cold, lethal rage, more terrifying than any shouting. The frozen king was gone, and in his place was something ancient and merciless. He picked up the rope, his knuckles white. He examined the clean cut, and then he looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I didn't have to say her name. He knew. In that moment, the bond between us, forged in quiet libraries and secret gift-giving, was solidified in the face of mortal danger. It was no longer a secret. It was a declaration of war. He called for a formal tribunal the very next morning. The great hall was packed, buzzing with rumor and speculation. I stood before the raised dais where Valerius sat upon his throne of dark, carved wood. I was no longer dressed as a laundress or a librarian, but in a simple, dark gown Ronan had provided, my arm bandaged beneath the sleeve. I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on me, but my gaze was fixed on the king. His face was unreadable, carved from ice, but I could feel the coiled fury beneath the surface. Lady Seraphina was brought forward. She looked magnificent, her head held high, a faint, condescending smile on her lips. She met my gaze with one of pure contempt. To her, this was all a pathetic piece of theater, a final, desperate grasp for attention by a commoner who had overstepped her bounds. Valerius laid out the accusation, his voice devoid of all emotion. He presented the severed rope. He spoke of the tapestry, the timing, the location. He did not accuse her directly. He simply stated the facts and then turned to her. "Lady Seraphina," he said, his voice echoing in the tense silence, "can you shed any light on this unfortunate event?" "I can, my lord," she said, her voice like honeyed poison. She turned to the assembled court. "It is a tragedy, of course. But what can one expect? The lower levels of this keep are full of vermin. Rats chew through ropes, and other more ambitious rodents get foolish ideas above their station. Her eyes flickered to me. Perhaps if this girl had remained in the basement where she belongs, scrubbing floors instead of whispering poison in the king's ear, no harm would have come to her. A gasp went through the hall. It was the slip, the arrogant, self-incriminating admission. She hadn't denied it. She had justified it. In her certainty of her own untouchable superiority, she had condemned herself. I saw Ronan's jaw tighten. Even the stern-faced lords on the council exchanged grim glances. Valerius listened, his expression unchanging. When she was finished, a profound silence descended. He sat for a long moment, looking at her, and it was as if he were seeing her and the world she represented for the first time. The ambition, the cruelty, the casual disregard for any life she deemed lesser than her own. It was everything he had been taught he must align himself with, and everything his soul now rejected. "You speak of station, my lady," he said at last, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall. "You believe your blood gives you the right to sit at my side. You believe it gives you the right to decide who lives and who dies within these walls. For years, I have lived by those same cold calculations. This kingdom has been ruled by bloodlines and alliances, by contracts of power, not of the heart." He stood, a towering, formidable figure. "No more." The words were a promise, a revolution in 2 syllables. Worth is not found in a name. Honor is not inherited. It is earned. It is proven in character, in courage, in integrity. He looked directly at me then, and the ice in his eyes finally, completely melted away, replaced by a warmth that was like the coming of the spring. "Qualities you," he said, turning his gaze back to a stunned Serafina, "have never possessed." His judgment was swift and absolute. Serafina was stripped of her titles and lands, banished from the kingdom under penalty of death. Her guards led her away, her beautiful face twisted into a mask of disbelief and hate. The hall remained silent, the court utterly shocked by the tectonic shift they had just witnessed. Then, Valerius did something no one could have predicted. He descended the steps of the dais. He walked past his stunned lords, past the rows of gaping courtiers, across the vast stone floor of the great hall. He did not stop until he was standing before me. The Alpha King, the ruler of the North, the man they called the Frozen King, went down on one knee. He took my hand, the one that was calloused from work and scarred from my fall, and raised it to his lips. "Elara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You came to this keep a laundress. You showed more honor than any highborn lady, more courage than any knight. You saw the man when everyone else saw only the king. You woke my heart when I thought it had turned to stone." He looked up at me, his stormy eyes full of a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "My joke of a title for you was a lie to keep you close. Let me offer you a true one." He held my gaze, his voice ringing through the silent hall for all to hear. "Be my queen." It wasn't a question. It was a plea, a statement of fact. The culmination of every stolen glance, every secret gift, every shared silence. It was the public vindication of the unseen woman, the recognition of a heart that had been watching from the shadows. And as I looked down at the king kneeling at my feet, I remembered my own foolish, bitter joke in the kitchen. I'd wed the first wolf that came through that door. The wolf had come, and my answer, spoken softly in the breathless hall, was the only one it could ever be. Yes, in the months that followed, the silent keep began to change. The transformation was slow at first, then all at once. The first sign was the sound of Valerius laughing. It happened in the library. I was telling him about the absurdities of the sock ledger, which had been ceremoniously burned on his orders, and the sound just escaped him, a deep, rich, wonderful sound that seemed to chase the last of the ghosts from the corners of the room. Soon, that sound became more common. The servants and guards, who had walked on eggshells for a decade, began to unhunch their shoulders. They started to smile. The gardens in the central courtyard, long neglected and choked with frost-hardened weeds, began to bloom. It was as if the land itself was responding to the thawing of its master's heart. Colors returned to a world that had been painted in shades of gray and white. The fortress no longer felt like a tomb, but a home. Valerius ruled with a new wisdom, one tempered not by cold logic alone, but by the empathy he had found with me. He listened to the small folk, to the merchants and the farmers, because he was married to a woman who had once been one of them, a woman who reminded him that a kingdom is not its castle, but its people. Our life settled into a new rhythm, one of public duty and private joy. We were a team in the council chamber and out of it. He taught me about statecraft, and I taught him how to mend his own clothes. He was, I discovered, spectacularly bad at it. One evening, I found him by the fire in our chambers, frowning in intense concentration at a gray wool sock that had a hole in the heel. He held a needle and thread with the grim determination of a man about to storm a fortress, and with about as much finesse. "You're holding the needle like a dagger, my love," I said, leaning over the back of his chair and wrapping my arms around his shoulders. He sighed, a gusty, dramatic sound of frustration. "This is more complex than any treaty negotiation," he grumbled, holding up his mangled handiwork. He had managed to sew the hole shut, but he had also sewn the entire sock closed in the process, creating a useless wool pouch. I couldn't help it. I started to laugh, leaning my head against his. He grumbled for another moment. Then the deep rumble of his own laughter joined mine. He turned in his chair to face me, his expression soft. He reached up and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. "Do you remember the day I saw you in the laundry?" he asked, his voice low. "The day I committed treason by laughing at your hosiery decree?" I smiled, vividly. I had gone down there I don't know what I was looking for. A flaw, a mistake, something to control in a world I felt was spinning out of my grasp, he confessed. "And then I saw you. You weren't afraid. You were tired and overworked, and you saw the absurdity of it all. You laughed. In all my life, surrounded by people who bowed and scraped and feared me, no one had ever been that honest. In that moment, you were the only real person in the entire keep." He took my hand, his thumb tracing circles over my knuckles. And then the wolf. It knew before I did. It saw its mate and had no patience for titles or propriety. It just wanted to bring you shiny things and steal your laundry. I squeezed his hand. Well, his methods were unconventional, but I can't fault his taste. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that still made my heart stumble. "Marta told me about the joke you made," he said, his golden eyes twinkling. "About the first wolf through the door." He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, his breath warm and smelling of wood smoke and wine. "No takebacks," he whispered against my mouth. And as he kissed me, with the warmth of the fire on our skin and the sound of a healing kingdom settling into a peaceful night outside our window. I knew that my foolish, desperate jest had somehow become the truest and most wonderful prophecy of my life. The wind no longer sounded like a thief at our window. It sounded like it was singing.